Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide, and today we're going to be taking a look at the WonderSwan. This is a very obscure console that not a lot of people have heard about or ever owned, and that's for good reason. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. But this was a joint effort between Koto Laboratory and Bandai. Bandai has since merged with Namco, and they're known as Bandai Namco, whereas Koto Laboratory, unfortunately, is no longer in business. Now, Koto Laboratory was founded by none other than Gunpei Yokoi. Hopefully I didn't butcher that, but this guy is a legend in the video gaming space. Not only did he design the original Game Boy, but he also created the Game & Watch, so he knows what he's doing when it comes to handhelds, and he has a long history with Nintendo. Now, this console was only ever released in Japan, so if you've never heard of it, that's why, although that didn't stop American retailers from importing it, which is actually how I picked up mine. I got a WonderSwan Color at my local GameStop about a year after it came out. The system released in 1999 and is considered part of the 6th generation of game consoles. The WonderSwan had 2 additional models released later on. Those were the WonderSwan Color, which is the one that I got, and the Swan Crystal. The platform was discontinued by Bandai in 2003. During its lifespan, no variation of this console ever released outside of Japan, at least not officially. The system used cartridges, which sat flush with the unit. It was powered off of one single AA battery, which at the time was really cool. The console was designed to be able to be played either in horizontal or vertical orientation, and a lot of games took advantage of that, especially shooters. Now, the WonderSwan's main competition when it released was still the Nintendo Game Boy. That's right, the original Nintendo Game Boy. A lot of people forget how long of a lifespan it had. But the WonderSwan was powered by a 16-bit processor. It had a lower price point and a longer battery life in comparison to the Game Boy. So it was more powerful than the Game Boy, and it had a lot of advantages that were appealing to Japanese gamers, but that didn't last long. With the release of the Game Boy Advance just about a year and a half later in Japan, this system just completely dominated the handheld space when it released, and it was vastly superior to the technical capabilities of the WonderSwan. The Game Boy Advance was a 32-bit console compared to the 16-bit WonderSwan. As I mentioned earlier, there were different variations of the WonderSwan. The WonderSwan Color came out right around the same time as the Game Boy Advance. The WonderSwan Color was really designed to make the console somewhat competitive and remain kind of relevant in the handheld space. If you're curious, this is a list of some of the games that released alongside the WonderSwan Color, including some heavy hitters such as Final Fantasy 2 and 3. Now, the system was powered off of a 16-bit NEC V30 processor, which was a variant of the Intel 8086. The WonderSwan Color kind of made some modifications, obviously, to the screen. When that came out, it had 2 different graphics modes. Graphics Mode A could do 57 colors simultaneously, while Graphics Mode B could do 241 colors simultaneously, and the system could do 28 sprites per line. So it was a relatively capable system. It also had 512 kilobytes of VRAM, which isn't a lot. So the WonderSwan Color came out, and obviously it had a color screen, but the screen quality was not great. The contrast ratio was pretty horrible. There was a little bit of ghosting. Another big issue that the system had is the controls. Because it was made primarily to be played vertically, when you're playing it horizontally, it worked, but it wasn't ideal. Now, despite being only released in Japan, surprisingly, there were a ton of games that were released in English. A great example of that is Judgment Silver Sword. This was a shooter that was designed to be played in vertical orientation. It had really smooth scaling and scrolling with the sprites. The color work was good. It had a ton of sprites on screen at the same time, which was impressive at the time that it released, especially when you compare it to the original Game Boy. Another great title is Klonoa Midnight Museum. Now, this is a series I absolutely love. I played the first entry on the original PlayStation 1 and every entry that's come out since. It's a really great franchise, and this was a solid entry in the series. Another great entry that is in English is called Makimura. Now, if you're in the States, you probably recognize this. It's a continuation of Capcom's Ghouls and Ghosts, or Ghosts and Goblins. It's a really great franchise, and this was a solid entry, although it's still incredibly difficult. Another great entry is Mr. Driller. Now, this came out on the WonderSwan color and took advantage of its capabilities. This was beautiful. It was just very vibrant and fast-paced. This was an awesome puzzle game. Speaking of puzzlers, this console also got an awesome version of Tetris, which was played in its vertical orientation and was so much fun. This was like one of the best handheld versions of Tetris that ever came out. And I had this and really, really loved it. And again, this is all in English. Another good example is Final Lap Special. This is a racing game with some pretty impressive looking scrolling for the time that it released. Again, especially if you consider that when it first came out, its primary competition was the original Game Boy. Compared to the Game Boy Advance, this doesn't look like anything special, but for the time that it released, it was a lot of fun. Another great game is a game called Run Dim. This is one of the few side-scrolling shooters that are played in the horizontal orientation. It featured really vibrant colors, some good sprite work, and overall just a lot of fun. Highly recommend this one if you can find it. I don't believe it goes for too much money these days. Another great entry is Final Fantasy. There were multiple entries on the WonderSwan, and all of them really took advantage of the hardware and pushed it to its limits. There was actually a limited edition Final Fantasy console made specifically for the WonderSwan color, and it is gorgeous. Shockingly, you can still find this on eBay for relatively cheap. Here's a loose copy of the console, $50. Here's complete in the box for $121, $140, $125. Definitely worth picking up. Another great game to pick up on this console was Rockman and Forte. If you're not familiar, Rockman is what Mega Man is called in Japan. So this was a really obscure Mega Man game that not a lot of people played, but it was actually really solid. Another great game on the platform was Digimon Adventure Anode. This was obviously on the color version of the WonderSwan. Graphically, it was one of the most impressive looking games. It had like a grid-based combat system, so it was so much fun. This is like one of my favorite games on the system. So far, I've only been talking about games, though, that are available on the console in full English. So what about the games that only came out in Japanese? Well, there's a lot of them, and fortunately, though, a lot of these games have simplistic enough controls that you can play them even without understanding Japanese. A good example of that is Guilty Gear Petite. This is a fighting game that came out on the WonderSwan color, and it was so much fun. And because, you know, you really had, if you were playing it in horizontal orientation, you really only had two buttons on the right to deal with, although there's a bit more complexity to it. I guess what I'm trying to say here is you don't really need to understand Japanese to enjoy this game. The system also got a really solid port of Golden Axe that released originally in the arcades and then got an awesome port on the Genesis, and this port for the WonderSwan color was exceptional. It was almost as good as the Genesis port, despite the hardware limitations at the time, and although this is completely in Japanese, because of the simplistic nature of the gameplay, you can for the most part get through this game without understanding any Japanese. You've got your basic jump, attack, and that's really it, and then your special magical move that you've got as well.
3月4日を待ちきれない。あのチョコボの不思議なダンジョンが、デジタルモンスターが、ぷよぷよ2が、軍兵が、新世代携帯ゲーム WonderSwan 来る WonderSwan.
So the WonderSwan is a very odd system, and it's got a really unique place in video gaming history. Overall, it throughout all of its variations, it sold about 3.5 million units and managed to obtain around 8% of the Japanese handheld video game console market before being discontinued, which is kind of impressive if you consider how much Nintendo dominated that market. For them to take 8% share was kind of impressive at the time. So that's going to do it for me today, guys. This was a shorter retrospective. Let me know in the comments if you ever played this system or if you plan on picking one up. As always, thanks for watching.